so much. So I'm told I have an hour, so I plan to take questions during the presentation. So I think just feel free to jump in at any point. I prefer it that way. And I'll try to leave about 5 minutes at the end also for questions, okay? So as was mentioned, I'm going to talk about trying to understand why are outcomes in college so different by first generation status, okay? And if the term is not familiar, first generation is basically students who are coming from households where neither parent has a college degree, opposed to continuing generation students where they're coming from households where at least one parent has a college degree. This is going to be in the context of the US. Hopefully, maybe some of the lessons or patterns that we show you here would be informative for some of the policy issues here. This is joint work with Esteban Osejo, who's at ASU. I used to be there. The data that we're going to be using here is going to be from ASU also. And Jacob French and Paula, who got started on this project when they were PhD students, and now Jacob is at assistant professor at NYU Stern, and Paula is at Louisiana State University. Okay, so to give you some motivation for what's going on, and this is pretty well known, that there are very, very large gaps by socioeconomic background in college attendance, okay, in the US. So, for example, here, if you look at the second bullet point here, pretty much like everyone who comes from a continuing generation family, about 90% of those kids end up enrolling in college, okay? Opposed to only about a third of students who are coming from first generation families. So there's already this huge gap in terms of enrollment in college based on socioeconomic background. And this is something that people have documented before, and there's a big literature which tries to understand why these gaps exist. So people have talked about how, credit constraints might be playing a role. So maybe college is too costly, even though, of course, you have subsidized student loans. There's also a literature which shows that there tend to be differences in terms of the backgrounds of students, academic strength, preparedness of students based on their backgrounds. And that is why you see these gaps in terms of college enrollment. I've done some work in the context of the role of information frictions being much more important for disadvantaged kids. And then there's also some work, because part of the reason why people go to college is, of course, there are these potential returns that you can possibly see down the road, but part of it is also the consumption value of college itself. And there's a literature which shows that people get, that the utility from this subjective consumption value could be very different, okay? And I think you have evidence for all of these, so I think each of these factors does play a role. What we're going to do in this paper is slightly different. We're not interested in these gaps that exist at the point of enrollment in college. We are interested in what happens once students arrive in college, okay? So unfortunately, even conditional on college enrollment, which already differs a lot by socioeconomic background, there's still a very large gap in terms of the outcomes once these students arrive in college. They just seem to be on different trajectories. So in the US, the 6-year, bachelor's is typically a 4-year degree, right? So, but a very small subset of students actually finish in 4 years. So the 6-year graduation rate in the US is about 65%, okay? Don't think about the Harvards or MITs, right? So that's where everyone is, but that's just taking a very small segment of the college going population, and those are not representative schools. But when you think about a representative college going population, only about 65% of those kids will end up graduating in 6 years. But even conditional, that's a pretty low completion rate, but that's for the overall population. But then when you look at first generation kids, their outcomes are even worse. Okay, so here what I'm showing you on this slide is for first generation students, based on one reference, are about 30 percentage points less likely to have a bachelor's degree 6 years after enrolling in higher education. Okay, so again, these are huge economic gaps, and you would have thought the fact that first generation students, they're already less likely to enroll in college, so there's differential selection. You'd have thought maybe first generation students would actually be doing okay in college because a much smaller subset of them are going there, but that's not what you're seeing. So what we're going to do in this paper is trying to understand why this is happening. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to use 3 different kinds of data sources. So from Arizona State University, we have anonymized student level transcript data. Okay, so that's going to be the administrative data. Then what we did is in recent last couple of years, we did surveys of students when they first arrive in college, and then we resurvey them. Basically, we have these some panel data on these students' expectations. And the third thing that I'll show you is what happened is ASU, so this intervention was not designed by us. ASU had put an intervention at some point in 2016, and the goal of that intervention was to target kids who are at a very high ex-ante risk of dropout, okay? And I'll show you how effective that program was. So basically, that's what I'm going to do in the presentation today. And this is work that is still in progress, so comments are very much welcome. So let me give you the punchline of the paper, and then I'll jump into the details. Yes?
So one of the things that I feel have important is that when students are entering university, or in the path, or a particular path in a sense. So, would it be fair to say that some of these would be a lot more effective if one were looking before university, like
Sure.
kind of interventions that could be?
Of course, I mean, it depends on the kind of friction that you're trying to fix, right? So, I can think of several interventions, like, this paper is not going to about this. Like, there's a big policy discussion about gender gaps in STEM, for example, or by socioeconomic background. And I personally think a lot of the interventions that are most likely to have the biggest bite are the ones that intervene in high school. Because if you didn't take calculus and so on in high school, it's just too late for me to intervene with you in college. So let me defer this question in this particular context, because I'll show you what was in place. That doesn't mean you cannot do interventions beforehand. The intervention that is going to be here is already once they are in college. There was another question somewhere? Yes.
You said only 55% complete graduation. What is the rest of 35%? Will they ever complete?
A very small proportion. No, the graduation rate will only go up by a few percentage points. So it's not that if you look at 8 years out or some. So now there is a little bit of, no. So I think if you look even at the broader college-going population, college completion rates, college completion rates are not much higher than that. So most of them think they're not going to, for the most part, the vast majority of them. Yeah. Okay. So let me. So what we're going to argue is, and I'm going to explain to you why we conclude this. We think what's going on is information frictions, particularly two kinds of information frictions. One is that these first generation students, they are much less informed about how to navigate the process of college itself. Okay. Maybe that doesn't come as a surprise. Like, think about it this way, like, you're the first kid from your family who's going to college. There's a lot of stuff to figure out, right? If you're already coming from a family where your parents went to college, you can go and talk with them. Or you have your social network is already like saturated with people who are coming from backgrounds where a lot of people have the know-how of how to navigate college itself. So I'll show you that these students are already much less informed about how to navigate college itself. And then on top of that, they're also coming in with much less information about their own ability. And so what I'll show you, for example, is they're coming into college wanting to do these pretty challenging majors, but then when you look at how well prepared they are for those majors relative to their counterparts, not that much. So what that means is their ex-ante likelihood of having to switch majors is very, very high. But when you ask them when they first arrive in college, how likely is it that you'll switch majors? They report a very, very low likelihood. Okay, so their expectations are going to be very unrealistic. I'll show you that.
Why do you classify these as information? Because in some sense, this is one expectation, as one way psychological processes are there too.
So I think that's a good point, and I'll show you some evidence that part of it is at least information based, but this is a good point, and I should tone the nature of the friction here, because later on, once we get to specifics, I'll tell you that we're not sure what's driving this, whether that's like a norm-based explanation, because I don't disagree with what you said. Okay. So so to give you a preview of what we're going to see in each of these contexts, so I'll show you that first generation students, not surprisingly, even at ASU, their outcomes are much worse, okay? And here's the thought experiment that we have in mind. So take two kids who are very similar, okay? One is a first generation kid and one is a continuing generation kid. They both get hit with a shock, an academic shock in the first year in college. So think about them getting a grade of a C or worse. What I'll show you is, otherwise these students look very similar in terms of observables. I'll show you that these two kids are going to respond to the shock in very different ways. The first generation student is going to be much more likely to just drop out of college. Their counterpart is much more likely to switch their major. Okay. Again, I'm not saying all of this is irrational. For some students, dropping out could be the rational outcome. But the point is, and I'll show you survey data, that first generation students, they just don't think of switching majors as a viable option, many of them. Okay. Yes.
What's the decomposition of students? Are they all domestic students or they're international students as well?
There is going to be a small, about 15% of the student body is going to be international.
So the definition of first generation students
is the same. It's just whether your parent had a college degree or not. But if you're wondering whether because international students are such a small part of the sample here, that they're not going to be driving.
The status of self-reported or
Sorry?
The status of first generation students is self-reported?
No, it's already in the administrative data.
Okay, different schools have different definitions. Some schools have definitions.
No, the first, you already know whether the parent has a college degree or not. So this is something that students report to the college at the time of applications. Okay. Now, of course, they could be lying and all that, but so I don't. If anything, I would think it would go the other way around. No one wants to downweigh the education attained.
Because in Canada, the definition is that if the parents will go to Canadian university, then they're considered as a first generation.
No, that's not the case in the US. As long as your parent has a four-year degree from anywhere, you'll be a continuing generation student. Okay. Okay. So what I'll show you from the surveys is that these first generation students, they're arriving in college with a lot more uncertainty than their counterparts. Their beliefs about their future expectations, like we asked them how likely it is that you'll graduate or what your GPA would be at the end of the year, they are much more biased than their counterparts. Okay. But what I'll also show you, and this goes back to the question that Ali was asking, was I'll also show you that over the course of the first year itself, you see students revising their expectations. Okay, so the point is it's not that their expectations, they're not responding to information. The issue is education is a sequential process, and if you don't learn quickly enough, a lot of dropout. So I'll show you about 50% of these first generation kids will end up dropping out. Half of that dropout happens within the first year, which again is not surprising, right? If you learn pretty quickly whether college is for you or not. And the point that I want to make here is if we could intervene early enough, you could try to remedy, some of this could be remedied, right? Okay, and what I'll show you then is there was this program that ASU had put in place, and that program actually seems to have a very large impact on graduation rates. And part of what we're finding, at least in the data, is we can't really, I have to acknowledge, because the program is going to be doing a bunch of different things. I'll give you more details about it. We can't really pin down exactly what is it about this program that makes it work. But one of the things that we see in the data is one of the channels through which it seems to be happening is by encouraging students to switch their majors earlier. Okay. So that's the road. That's basically a preview of a general.
It seems to me that if they enter the college, they will overlook.
Sure.
And after 1 or 2 semesters, they start becoming a backward person.
So it's not that. So I mean, expectations by definition. Yeah, but the point is, yeah. So I wouldn't necessarily phrase it the way you phrased it, but maybe we are saying the same thing, which is when they're arriving in college, everyone is over optimistic. First generation students as well as their counterparts. Everyone is way over optimistic because the ex post outcomes for these first generation students are going to be much worse. Ex ante, the extent of over optimism is much higher. And what I'll show you is over the course of the first year, the first semester itself, these expectations arguably start looking more reasonable. It's not, the outcome is still going to be 4 years down the road. We're just tracking their expectations in the first year. Okay. So I'm going to move into the details. So I'll keep this very, very brief. In terms of the literature review, I think one other discouraging thing, if you look at the higher education space, is very few interventions work. Okay, the interventions that have worked tend to be extremely expensive, and you can't really scale them. And they tend to focus on very specific things, like very small things in the production function. So that's one thing. And so I'll tell you about the intervention that was here. So we're going to be speaking to this literature. And of course, there is a literature where people have now for some time been collecting data on expectations from students and how students revise and so on. I've done some work. Todd Steinbrücker has done quite a bit of work. A lot of my work actually prior to this project was in very selective schools where the issues are just very different. Okay, so when you think about like, where do we have data of this kind in a representative setting, you just don't have that many settings like this. Okay, so let me start out with the administrative data. So our data is going to be coming from ASU. So if you don't know, ASU is actually one of the largest public universities in the US. What I'm showing you here, so I think, yeah, this works. So actually ASU looks pretty similar to other flagship universities on most dimensions. Couple of differences. First, given the demographics of the state, the Hispanic proportion is going to be much larger. So about a quarter of students are Hispanic students. The black share is pretty small. It's only about 4%. There was a question that was asked earlier. Actually, only about 9% of students are international students here. Okay, so the thing that actually which makes ASU a little different from other schools is if you look at the 75th percentile of the ACT distribution, that's actually pretty similar for ASU as when you compare it with other flagship universities. Where there's a big difference is in the left tail of the distribution. So ASU actually pretty much admits anyone. Okay, so that's why you have this big left tail here. I don't know if you know this. There was this college scandal, right, where a lot of like people were paying, and one of the quotes from I think it was Felicity, the actress, one of these people. One of the quotes was like, "I want my kid to go anywhere but ASU." That was the quote. Okay, so that tells you basically, like, they pretty much admit anyone, and there's a reason. Like their charter is more. They argue that it's more about inclusion rather than exclusion. So we can talk about that at some other point. Okay. So, but the point is that this is really a very representative college population. When you think about the marginal student who's at the margin of deciding whether to enroll in college or not, you're going to find that student there. So we have data going back to the early 2000s. So we have about, and ASU itself, not only is it representative, it's a very large public school. So in recent years, each incoming cohort is about 15,000 students. Okay, so each year. Okay, so it's a huge cohort. So that's where you can actually cut the data in some interesting ways. So about a third of students are first generation students at ASU. I should have mentioned this earlier. When you look at the college-going population in the US itself, that's also a third of all those kids are first-generation students. So that's another reason, like this question hasn't come up. Why look at first-generation status? Why not look at other measures of your socioeconomic identity? You can do that, but I think first-generation status, first, there are so many of them. And secondly, when we think about social mobility and colleges as an engine of mobility and so on, this is really the subpopulation that I think would be of interest. About a quarter of our students are going to be minority students, but again, most of them are Hispanic. Okay, so very few black students like most other schools. I'm just showing you the data here to give you a sense of what's going on in the data. Okay, so this clicker does work. So if you look at what's happening in terms of what proportion of students graduate in 4 years, you see 48% of first generation students graduate in 4 years. Versus about 55% of continuing generation students. So that's, in economic terms, that's a huge gap. First of all, the level itself is fairly low, but even conditioned on that low level, you see this pretty large gap. So not surprisingly, about a quarter of first generation students end up dropping out. So when I say drop out, we have data linked with the National Clearinghouse data set. So we can see if you show up in another post-secondary institution, because you might think, okay, part of the story could be that these students transfer to another school. When I say drop out, they are dropping out from higher education, okay? Versus about 17% of continuing generation students. I think one of the other things, you might think, okay, what could be happening is these students, first generation students, they arrive in college wanting to major in very different fields than their counterparts. Part of that is true, but when you look at the economic potential, like we don't have the earnings of these students. We know what their major was at the point of entry, as well as at the last point when we see them in college. In terms of the earnings potential, this is saying first generation students, the median earning in the major in which they start out is about $50,000 a year, okay? In economic terms, very similar to what their counterparts are sorting into, even though I'll show you that they're going to be different majors. Switching is a very common phenomenon in the US higher education system. So what this is saying is, this is a conditional outcome. Conditional on graduating, about 50% of students end up switching their majors. So I know that's very different from what you, in Pakistan, I know you typically first choose a major and then you arrive in college. In the US, it's quite the opposite. Like you can have for the most part, with few exceptions, you can arrive in college and it's pretty flexible in terms of the major you choose. It's not binding, yes. With the one exception can be sometimes this engineering school. Typically, you have to apply to the engineering school from the beginning separately.
But you just go into a program and
you go in and exactly, you can move around quite easily. Engineering is trickier.
So the other question I have is that we don't know a sense of the economic penalty that people are facing when they drop out.
That's a good question. So we don't have labor market data for these people. But we have something in our survey. Like one thing you might think here is maybe the outside option is different for these people, right? So we have data on their expectations of what they think they will make if they don't have a college degree. I'll come to that.
Do we know, like, just using aggregate data, that what's the kind of economic penalty amongst those who drop out?
So the college premium itself, so I think what you're asking is basically how does the college premium evolve over the life cycle? I think that's what you're asking. The causal college premium is very hard to estimate, but typically because of the way life cycle earnings are, they're only going to get larger. Right. But that's not the causal college premium. Yeah. Okay. So you see, the point I want to make is switching majors is very common. But again, you see that these first generation students are somewhat less likely to switch majors. The first semester GPA of these students is also quite different. And the point here is that these first generation students, they're coming in, they're also less prepared when they arrive in college. So this shouldn't really be surprising. And I'm not going to comment on the other points, but the one thing that you might think here is, okay, you see these differences, these are just raw differences. But these first generation students also, on average, typically come from lower income families and so on. So to what extent is this driven by other observables? So in the last column here, what I'm showing you is basically the weighted difference. So we do a course exact matching. We're very flexibly controlling for a lot of different observables. And of course, observables are part of the story, but you can see that a lot of these differences are still both economically and statistically significant. So if you, for example, look at if you ever graduate, there's a 6 percentage point gap that goes down to only about 5 percentage points. So the point is, there's something fundamentally about being a first generation student itself that is causing these very different outcomes. Okay, it's not about differences in other observables. Yeah. So because here we need to have a lot of data on your background characteristics. So you need to have your parents' income and all these things. And we don't observe parental income for every student. Because you have to have applied for financial aid and so on. That's how the university would know. So that's why the CEM sample is. I'm going to be more specific about it once I get into the analysis, but that's what is going on here. Okay, yes?
You mentioned that the switching programs is easier for flexible in the US. But how binding are the choices of your first year courses?
Yeah, I'm going to come to that. In terms of so you're saying how portable is the coursework in a given? Yeah, I'm going to come to that in a few slides. Okay, then I'll answer that question. Okay, okay. So what's going on? So okay, before we move to the survey data, we want to see how far could we push the administrative data, and of course that's going to be somewhat limited. As I mentioned earlier on, a lot of the dropout happens itself in the first year. Not surprising again, right? So the question that we want to ask is, which I mentioned when I was giving the preview, is here's the thought experiment. You take two students who are otherwise quite similar. I'll be more specific about what I mean by otherwise being very similar. One is a first generation student and one is a continuing generation student. And we hit them with the same academic shock in the first year. So what we have in mind is the shock that we're going to have is what happens if you take these students and they both get a grade of a C or a worse grade in a first year course within the same major. Okay, so two students, they're pursuing the same major, they look very similar, they both get a C. How do they respond differently? That's the question that we're interested in. Of course, you can't randomize people into getting this shock, so we're going to be limited here. So what we're going to do is basically going to do a matching exercise. But we're going to do this in a very flexible way, because what we have here is we have information about their high school GPA, their ACT scores. We know what area of study that they're interested in at ASU, what is their state of residence, whether they're an honor student, their household income, and race. And we're going to match them very, very flexibly along these dimensions, okay? So, for example, in terms of income, household income, we're going to do it in terms of quintiles and so on, okay? So this is pretty demanding. It's very non-parametric and pretty flexible. Of course, the assumption here is that conditional on these observables sorting into this event is orthogonal to other unobservables, okay? And once I show you the results, we'll try to relax those assumptions also. So that's basically what we're going to do here. And the event that we're going to focus on is what happens if you get a grade of a C or worse in the first semester. And this is it's not a very uncommon outcome. So about 46% of first generation students get a grade of a C or worse, and about a third of continuing generation students, okay? Let me show you what's happening on this slide, and let's start out with the first panel, okay? So these are students who don't get this shock. They don't get any bad grades. If you look at what happens, what happens in terms of their dropout, you see there's not much difference in economic terms between continuing and first generation students. About 12 to 13% of them will end up dropping out at some point, okay? Now this is the group where these students have received the shock, which is they got a grade of C or worse in at least one other course in the first year. Again, this is in the same major. This is conditional on all those differences. So what you see here is about 22% of these first generation or continuing generation students will end up dropping out. But on the other hand, if you look at first generation students, almost a third of them are dropping out, okay? So, and not surprisingly, this is the mirror image of this in some ways, because you can see here that these students, the first generation students who get this shock are significantly less likely to graduate. Part of the story here is going to be, so if you look at what happens here, if you don't get this shock, you see that almost half of these students still end up switching their majors subsequently, okay? This was the point that I made earlier, like major switching is very common. When you look at this group of students who actually got this shock, again, you see this difference in terms of how these first generation and continuing generation students are responding, okay? They're less likely to switch majors. Now you wonder, so far we've only been doing this matching exercise, right? We're not allowing for selection on unobservables, which is a strong assumption. We can relax this a little bit. So here we're going to do basically, we're going to do an exercise which is very similar in spirit to the Tonji-Tabor Elder method, right? Which is how much selection there would have to be on unobservables for these results to be overturned. So let's just focus on the first two columns, for example. What this is saying is first generation students, once they are hit with this event, are about 7 percentage points more likely to drop out. We're putting in controls that doesn't matter so much. What this is saying, this is the row that's the important row. This is saying that the selection on unobservables would have to be 47 times stronger than the selection on your observables for this result to be overturned. So typically you want a number which is greater than 1 in magnitude, okay? And you see that at least for the first three variables, these numbers are well above 1. At the point that it's very unlikely that this is because of unobservables, okay? In the last column, what I'm showing you here is somewhat suggestive, which is, this is the share, this is the share of your poor grades where you exercise the withdrawal option. So part of our story here is like, part of college is knowing how you navigate it. So if you're struggling and if you're en route to getting a failing grade in the course, it actually is, for the most part, optimal for most people to just withdraw from the course because it's not going to affect your GPA. So what you're seeing here is, and we see in the data that first generation students are less likely to exercise this withdrawal option. Now this could be consistent with many things. We think one of the reasons why this could be happening is they might be less likely to know that this is an option that they can exercise. You can cut the data in terms of, like, if you don't like this shock, you can cut it in terms of GPA. One thing that I wanted to mention here is even though we've matched these people pretty well on a lot of observables, one thing that we didn't have in our main data is high school quality, okay? And in the US, because of segregation, high school quality differs a lot. So a GPA of a 4.0, high school GPA of a 4.0 in a high income neighborhood school could mean way different from having the same GPA in a low income neighborhood. But for the students who are in-state, we actually know which high school they went to. So then we can basically control for your high school quality. We can do the same exercise and match students also based on high school quality. And you see the same thing. And the other thing that you also see here is, part of the story, even though we're matching these people, but you might think what might be happening is, if I'm a first generation student, if I'm getting hit with this shock, there could be other things that are also happening at the same time. Like, I'm already coming from a household which is financially strained, so it could be my parents lost their job and so on. So it could be that this is picking up not only this shock, but also a lot of other things that are happening at the same time. What we do is we also do the analysis only looking at students who are below median income, where arguably a lot of these other constraints are binding to the same extent. And we see something very similar. So the point that I want to make here is we don't think it's being driven by some of these other confounds that you might have in mind. Yes?
So in your last bit for the ball, maybe first generation students have less time to complete the degree, they have the pressures, they have the money, they try to drop at the other, so extend it.
Right.
And the other thing that I was thinking of was stock and switching majors are is it that we continuing generation they're going to do instructors more, they have more peer support, all other types of support.
Exactly. So the second one, I'm going to come back to this definitely. I think definitely that is happening. The first question that you had was, that's why I said it's consistent with the lack of information, but it could also be consistent because part of it, the reason why you might not want to withdraw from a course is typically to maintain your financial aid. You are required to enroll in a certain number of courses. So that's where when we do the below median income students, they're equally likely to be on financial aid, so that constraint should be equally binding. We see something very similar, but the last result, I don't want to push it too much because we also lack precision there. There was a question.
So you also lack
second to last, switching majors? No, we don't. Yeah, no, but I think that's partly because of how we drew it, because I'm fairly sure, when you look at switching majors, it's still precise at conventional levels. That gap is still there. Yeah. Yes.
We're going to define batch jobs as any course in which you get a C.
C, of course.
C, which may or may not be relevant to the major.
No, it's a major specific course. And we're already matching, when you do the matching, it's conditional on not on the specific major, but the college that you're in.
So for example, if I intend to do economics,
yes.
So like if I get a batch job in history, that will not be counted.
That won't be counted as a shock here. And as I said, you can do this in many flexible ways, you get ways, but that won't be counted here. Any other questions? Okay. So, so I've shown you that what happens once these students get this negative shock, first generation students relative to their counterparts are more likely to drop out. They're significantly less likely to switch majors. So why is this happening, right? Before we go to the survey data, there are some things that we can investigate in the transcript data itself. The first story that you might have in mind is, okay, maybe these first generation students, they're already sorting into less competitive majors, so there's not much else that they can switch down to. That's a plausible hypothesis, right? Or the other question that was asked earlier was, maybe they are going into majors where they're acquiring this major specific capital, which is not very portable across majors, right? So having a high opportunity cost of switching. What I'm showing you here is what happens at ASUs once students are admitted, they have to take a math test. And the reason they administer this math test is to basically place you in the right level of math. So basically we have one measure of math ability for these students, like it's the same measure for everyone. Here I'm cutting the data by the tercile in which your score was. So these are students who performed in the lowest tercile. And I'm looking at, okay, given their ability and the majors that they decided to go into when they first arrived in college, what was the likelihood that they would have graduated with that major? Okay, given their incoming ability, using historical data, right? Because we know historically someone who had this score what was the likelihood that they would have graduated. What this is saying is students in the lower tercile, continuing generation students, there's a likelihood of about 30% that they would actually graduate in that major, versus about 28% for first generation students. No matter where you look, in which part of which tercile you look, the point here is that first generation students, if anything, are going into majors which are more competitive. Okay, so it's not the case that they're sorting into less competitive majors. The question about, like, portability of majors. So that's the measure that we use here is, we can see if you took a certain major course, how likely it is that students in other majors who have successfully completed those majors have also taken that course in the past. Okay, that's one measure of portability. You can come up with other measures, and it's a standardized. We standardize this measure here, and of course, you would expect that this would be trending downwards over time, right? As you move through college, like courses in the first semester tend to be much more general in relative terms, right? And as you move, like in the third year of college, they start becoming much more specialized. You see this downward pattern here for both groups. But the point is that if anything, these first generation students, based on this measure, are sorting into majors which are more, the coursework is actually more portable, not less portable. So we don't think that's what is going on, that these students are choosing majors where they invested in this human capital that is going to be useless if they were to switch majors. Okay, I'm going to skip the next slide. So I'm not going to move, yes.
Is it also possible that real effects are playing?
Of course. I'll show you some, there was a question asked earlier also about social support. I'm going to get to so far everything was based on the transcript data. In the surveys, we can say something about the social networks. I'll show you, let me show you some patterns. We can't really do much about peer effects right now, given what we have. But I think part of the reason why the program is also very effective, it has something to do with peer effects. And I have to get all of that done in the next 20 minutes, yes. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't ask questions, yes.
I'm just curious why you look at this the first semester drop, or do you look at a drop as well and this will be the first semester?
But the problem is, like, you already have a significant amount of dropout when you arrive in the second semester. So at the end of the first year, 40% of the dropout has already happened. Overall dropout.
The dropout you show is basically at the end of the first semester.
No, this dropout is final, like this is ever dropout. The outcome there was, but your question was, why not do the same exercise with students in the second semester? There's differential selection. That was the reason. Yeah. Okay. So the survey, basically what we did is in 2021, we fielded this survey, and the idea was basically, when students are first arriving in college, let's try to collect some data on them, right? Surprisingly, it shouldn't be that hard to do this, but there isn't that much work that's done that. So we collected data from about 1,400 students. So as I said, each quarter was about 15,000 students or so. We got a response rate of about 10%. I'll talk about selection in a moment. And then, so this is done early in the fall semester, basically when they first arrive in college. Then we go back to the same population in the middle of the second semester, in the spring semester. Again, we compensate them. Here the survey is slightly shorter. We get about 800 students completing the survey, and about 450 students, we can match them back to the first survey. Okay. You might wonder about what kind of selection we're getting. This sample that we're going to get is going to be slightly higher ability and more white than the ASU average. In terms of attrition between the two rounds, we don't see any differential selection in terms of observables. Okay. So what I'm going to do in the next few slides, I'm just going to start showing you some descriptive patterns from the data in the baseline survey, and then I'll move to what happens in the panel. Okay. So what this is saying is not surprising. So and the way this is going to be set up, I'm going to show you the mean for different survey measures for first generation and continuing generation students, and this is the difference. So what this is saying is, if you look at the ACT scores, it's a measure of incoming ability, the ACT scores are lower by about 4 points. That's a huge difference. This is somewhat related to the point about the social networks. If we ask them how many students do you know at ASU, okay, and you see there's a large gap. There's a gap of about, first generation students typically know 5 students less than their counterparts. That's one way of trying to get at these social networks. In our survey, we had both questions, a whole battery of questions about time management skills and mental health. These are both standardized. These are survey-based measures. And what you've seen here is this, based on the survey data itself, First generation students are rating themselves as worse in terms of time management. This is self-assessed. They're also reporting much lower mental health relative to their counterparts. This was the question that I mentioned earlier. Is part of the story you might think is, okay, maybe first generation students, they're more likely to drop out because they think their outside option is very attractive. What I'm showing you here is we asked these students, okay, how much do you think you'd be earning down the road if you were to graduate from college? We had a separate question where we asked them, how much do you think you would be earning if you don't graduate? The levels are, of course, very different for the two groups. I'm just showing you the ratios, and both report very similar ratios. So at least part of the story is that this does not seem to be about differences in perceived outside options. And the last thing I'm showing you here is for first generation students, actually the net costs of attending college are much lower because they're much more likely to get need-based aid. Okay? So, okay, now let's move on to self-reported personality traits. So in our survey, we had a whole bunch of questions. You know, there's a lot of work on soft skills these days on these big 5 personality traits, grit and so on. We don't find anything systematically different between the two groups in our survey. That's what we found here. Okay. The next thing that we did is we asked these students about how certain they are about what their GPA is going to be down the road. And the way we do this might look complicated, is we ask these students what's the likelihood that their GPA at the end of the first year is going to fall in each of these bins. And the answer has to sum to 100. This is an online survey. There are all these checks built in. And what we do is we fit the response basically to a parametric distribution. I'm going to skip the details. So basically this uncertainty that you see here is basically the mean subjective uncertainty of these individuals. And we've already standardized this measure. So what this is saying is first generation students, their uncertainty is higher by about an 11% of a standard deviation. They're coming in arriving in college with much more uncertain expectations about their future GPA. Okay? What we do here is because part of the story you wanted to get at is, you might be misinformed about your own ability, but you also might not have a very good sense of what your peers are up to, right? So in the survey, we asked these students, what's the likelihood that your peers will graduate in 4 years, or what proportion of students will actually return back the next year? What has that historically been? And we know those statistics, right? So what I'm showing you here is the absolute error. I could have shown the error as well. Basically, both first generation and continuing generation students tend to overestimate the outcomes for their peers. But the overestimation is larger for first generation students. Okay? This is about now themselves. What we're doing here, so I think this is in some ways you can see it's pretty stark. So we ask these students, okay, what's the likelihood that you'll graduate in 4 years? Remember, the 6-year graduation rate is around 50%. These students, first generation students, are saying, oh, there's an 90% chance that I'm going to graduate in 4 years. Okay. Similarly, for continuing generation students, so this was the question asked earlier, everyone is over optimistic, right? But it's not like by some margin, like they're way off the mark. What I'm showing you here in this last row is we asked these students, what do you think your GPA would be at the end of this semester? And then because we have access to the transcript data, we see what their GPA was. What this is showing is the mean absolute error between what they expected and what their GPA was. Okay, so and I'll show you the distribution in a couple of slides. But the point is, these first generation students, their absolute error is much larger. They're more off than their counterparts. Okay, I'm going to skip that part. I'm going to also skip this. Okay, so the other thing that we did in the survey is we asked these students, if your GPA was to fall in each of these bins, how likely it is that you would switch your majors? Okay, so of course you would expect, like, if I'm already doing really well, the likelihood that I'll switch my major should be lower, right? So you see this downward sloping trend. But the point is that, throughout the distribution, first generation students, the blue bars, they're less likely to say that they think they will have to end up switching their majors. And in some ways this is surprising because I already showed you, if anything, first generation students are sorting into more competitive majors, right? So the likelihood that they would actually have to switch majors should be much higher. But when you look at the subjective expectations, it's the other way around. It is the case that first generation students are also, in the survey we asked them, like, what are the reasons, what were the factors that drove you to choose the major that you did? And they do cite very different reasons. So for example, job stability is much more important for first generation students, which is not surprising. Okay?
This is the case that you give us the expectations, but it could be that they have different expectations about by doing different things.
Yeah, so that's,
So that could be I mean, it could be random, or it could be also.
it could be, but it's very, you'd have to come up with a very specific story.
So it is very.
Yeah, no, you can come up with a story. Yeah, but you can come. But I think where I thought but because you raised your hand, I think earlier you were asking, and this is the point where I wanted to bring this up. This does not necessarily have to be an information fiction. You can also think that could be something about a social norm, right? If I switch my major, maybe that's considered a failure, right? Given my background.
So that's what I find fascinating. Is it a norm, or is it the fact that I think if I go from social science, my life also goes wrong?
Yeah, so we cannot distinguish the two. So in our survey, we don't have anything about social norms. But what I show you is clearly, whatever it is, you can fix it through some of these interventions. But here I want to be, because this is an important point, we don't know whether this is a norm-based explanation, what you're seeing on this slide is norm-based or information-based. Okay? Okay, so let me give you some preview from the panel data, just so that you know, and then I'll jump to the intervention. Let me skip this slide. So here's a thought experiment that we have in mind. So remember, and here we're using students who answered both surveys. What I'm showing you here is the gap between what their GPA was at the end of that semester when we surveyed them and what they said their GPA was going to be. So a positive number means that their GPA came out to be higher than what they were expecting. They were like pleasantly surprised. And the negative number, of course, is that they got this negative news. For continuing generation students, you can see the blue bar this is for generation students. The blue mean is somewhat negative. Okay, so on average, these students are getting a negative shock, and for continuing generation students, the news is slightly positive. But the point is, you're getting information. Some students are being positively surprised, and some are being negatively surprised, and that's what we're going to leverage here. So the question that we are interested in is this thought experiment. Okay, so these are the students who got this positive information. So when we did the survey, in both surveys, we asked them their expectations for the same outcomes, okay? So what we're doing here is, we're asking them what they think the GPA would be when they graduate. So students who receive this positive news, perhaps not surprisingly, they revise up their expectations. Students who revise this negative news, they revise downwards on average. The revisions are much larger for first generation students. So what I'm showing you here is this diff and diff estimate, which is the difference between this blue bar and this one minus this difference, okay? So the relative responsiveness to negative news, basically, by first generation students, you see that they're revising their expectations about their GPA at graduation by about 0.17 GPA points. You see something for all outcomes, something very similar for all outcomes. If you ask them, what's the likelihood that you'll graduate in 4 years? Again, the diff and diff estimate is about 8 percentage points downward revision. Again, this could be very rational, right? I told you already the extent of over-optimism was much larger for first-generation students. I already showed you that they're also much more uncertain to start out with, right? So I'm not saying this is necessarily irrational. It could very much be rational. But the point here is, it's not that these students they seem to be responding in what looks like a rational way, okay? You see, you can do the same thing for other expectations. Now the question here is, whether we think that this updating is, whether we can say something about whether this is information based or not. So what we do here, I'm not going to show you the figures in the interest of time. So ex ante, you would think students who are much more uncertain, right? So I arrive in college, I have no idea how this is going to go for me, right? And I receive either a positive shock or a negative shock. Under Bayesian updating, if I'm more uncertain, I should be much more responsive to that information. And you see the patterns that I showed you on the previous slide, they're all being driven by students who have higher ex ante uncertainty, okay? So that's very much information based. This was it's not really about peer effects. It's part of the story is, if you arrive in college, grades are not the only way of acquiring information, right? You can acquire information through a social network, through your peers, and through your advisors. We, of course, don't observe that. One proxy that we're using here is the size of your network, okay? So the idea here is, okay, if your network is very sparse, maybe you're not getting that much information, so then this information on your grades should really be informative about what is going on. And we see exactly the same thing. It's exactly these students who are very sparse social networks who are very responsive to this information. And the last thing is, ex ante, you would also think the students who are really misinformed about, what their peers are up to, they're the ones who should be responding more. And that's exactly what we find. Okay, so to us, it seems to be, at least part of this seems to be an information-based story. Of course, we cannot say whether one group is updating too much or too little because we just don't have data to construct a benchmark. Okay, so far the data that I've shown you seems to be consistent in part, like in just a general information fiction, but also just a lack of how to navigate college itself. So now let me. There was another thing that I just wanted to highlight here is, in the survey we asked students, okay, if you're struggling academically, who would you go and talk to? Not surprising, if you're a first generation student, your parents didn't go to college, they might have less to offer, or might have less useful advice. So you see precisely the same thing in the survey. First generation students are much less likely to say that they will go and seek help from a family member. Okay, so in the last 5 minutes, I think I'll be okay on time. In the last 5 minutes, I want to at least end on a positive note, which is, okay, you see these differences, what can be done about it? I already mentioned, in higher education, people have, of course, tried interventions for quite some time. And things that have worked are not really, like the few interventions in higher education that have worked cost thousands of dollars per year per student. So they're just not scalable. At ASU, what happened is in 2016, they started a program, LEAD, it's an acronym for this here. I mentioned this earlier, we're not going to be able to pin down what's happening, what is it about this program which makes it successful. But let me give you a sense of what is happening in the program. So what happens in the program is, when students are admitted, because ASU they have a lot of information about your incoming ability and preparedness, right? So they come up with an index score, which is like, what is the risk that this student is eventually going to struggle academically or drop out, okay? Based on that score, they encourage students who are below a certain threshold to enroll in this program. So now what is happening in this program is going to replace the standard coursework that you would have to take. So it's not these courses that you have to take on, this is not remedial education. So this is courses that you would take in place of the standard curriculum. And what happens is you are surrounded basically by other students who are also coming from very similar backgrounds and who are also going through the same challenges. So in that sense, it's a very homogeneous group, because part of, I think, we can't really capture it in our surveys. Part of it is also because as a first generation student, you're the first one to arrive there, you start struggling academically, you just don't know where to go. So this is basically very homogeneous groups, very small class sizes, and they assign to you both student as well as faculty mentors. So part of it, we think part of what is happening is they're providing you information, but also providing you with social support. Again, we can't really pin down each of these things. And the program itself is not very costly because, this is not something that students have to take on top of their standard curriculum. This is replacing what they would have had to take. So it actually costs only about $1,000 per year per student.
The course is the same, but with some augmentation of courses.
The courses, the first year they are different. The first semester they are different. But as you move forward, like for example, Econ 101 or Math 101, the content would be fairly similar. They're supposed to cover the same content. And I learned recently, even at Michigan, they have the same program. So schools have started to, I don't want to say same program, they have a program which seems to be doing share some of the same components, basically. Okay. So basically that's, and the other thing, which is they also focus a lot on building these soft skills. So, time management, coming up with a plan and so on, these are assignments that are assigned. So that kind of stuff is not done in the standard course.
And when you say cost of the program, you're including the cost of the additional credits.
So basically the main cost here, think about it this way, because it's not that these students have to take this program on top of existing coursework. So you only have to hire the same number of instructors that you would have had to do otherwise. I don't know the breakdown of the cost. I think it's mostly coming from the mentoring program. Yeah.
So apart from mentoring, is there an academic component?
You have to take the same courses. There's still an academic component, like you're taking the same courses that a typical student would have to take in the first couple of semesters. But you're now taking them under this program, and the class composition is different. There are smaller classes, and there are also students who are from similar backgrounds as you. I mean, that $1,000 is covering that also.
Basically, any course that you will take in those courses.
In pretty much any course. I don't want to say. No, you are encouraged to. So that's the thing. So let me. So okay, maybe here. So basically, you have so this program exists. Okay. In orientation, like the week before, a couple of weeks before the semester starts, they start sending out these reminders. So students who are at a very high risk of dropout, they recommend these students to enroll in this program. Anyone can enroll in this program. So what you can see here is this is normalized the cutoff. Students below this cutoff, they are being encouraged to enroll in the program. Students above the cutoff, the program is open to them, but they're not being especially encouraged to enroll in the program. Okay.
And what's different than so that you do an internship in your econ class?
Right.
So this is a separate section.
You know, it's going to be a different course number, but it would count as the same as Econ 101. Okay. It is supposed to, so Econ 101 is supposed to cover the same, but in the first year there are some courses which are general skill courses. They will probably cover, there is not going to be full overlap. Okay, so basically what we do here is basically we use this fuzzy RD design. Okay, so you already helped me set the stage, so I can jump to the results and I'll conclude there. So what you're seeing here is this is I'm just showing you the reduced form. Graduation goes up by 10 percentage points around this cutoff. That's a huge impact in terms of graduation. And they're also graduating with higher GPAs. Okay, so now a cynic might say, okay, one thing which these people could be doing is they might be pushing students into these majors that are very easy to graduate with, but they have very low labor market returns, right? It's a plausible hypothesis. Of course, we don't observe earnings of these students, but we know what is the major that they graduated with. So in the last column, what I'm showing you is what are the median earnings of typical graduates in that major. So what I'm showing you here is that their earnings are lower, that these expected earnings or predicted earnings are lower only by about $1,000, okay, on a base of $49,000. So it doesn't seem that these students are going into majors which have no labor market returns. But the other thing that the program really seems to be doing is not that it's causing these students to switch majors more often. What it's doing is it's encouraging these students to switch majors earlier, okay? So that's basically, and you might think, because some of these impacts are in fact very large, because we have data from cohorts where this program didn't exist, but the risk score was still there, right? So you can see if there's something about that risk score itself, and you don't see anything for these pre-lead cohorts. So that makes us really think that there really is something here. Yes.
Yeah. When you're doing, so the students are going through the life cycle, do the courses become more and more similar?
No, so this lead program is pretty much only the first year. It's only the first year. After that, like, yeah, sorry, I didn't mention that. So it's pretty much the first year, yeah. So Econ would only have like the Econ 101 and 102 offered under this and so on, and some general studies. Okay, so as I said earlier, you know, we don't really know what's going on, but in our survey we asked some of these questions, like, you know, about. So let me. I'll just pick one of these. Question 3 is like, you know, did ASU improve? Did your ASU experience help improve your mental health or not? And I'm comparing students who are very similar around this cutoff, but one group was in the lead program and the other wasn't. So for the most part, you see, like, you know, part of it is in terms of, like, you know, creating a stronger group of friends and so on, things that have come up already, right? Again, this is just suggestive. As I said, we can't really pin down what exactly about the program led to it to work, but we think all of these things are going on. So let me stop here. I won't repeat myself. I think let me just say, like, I think what we think is going on is, you know, like, students are coming in, they just don't know how to navigate the process, the system itself, and they're also very misinformed and very over-optimistic. And it seems that targeted interventions can be successful. So in terms of what we're doing, I think this is something that I'm personally really interested in now, and I think we because things have come up even today, like, you know, how much of the lack of switching majors is information-based or norm-based. These are things that we didn't do anything about in our surveys, and I think these are the kinds of questions we're interested in. So that's in a research agenda that I want to continue. And I think I'm out of time, but I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, so I want to go back to.
I know you can't say about
Yeah.
Is it really information or whether it's, you know, education?
I think it's
So,
I think
so for me, what is the test would be to find out that there is the expectations of these students are will have greater errors per semester.
Sure.
So there is potentially a role for information intervention, but the typical information intervention would be just giving some media statistical
Sure.
right?
Okay.
How many of
Yeah.
them. So, but this is not something.
This is not doing that. Yeah.
Would you like to speculate if you were to just throw out information at people to see?
So I think the problem is that I'm happy to speculate, but I think so think about it this way. A lot of this information, college counselors and advisors have that. From your own experiences, the faculty in this room, the students who typically come to your office hours are the ones who don't need to come to office hours. They're already doing really well. I think these are overachievers typically, right? The ones who really need to be coming to your office hours are the ones who are not coming. So the point, like, if there was a way for me to like feed them that information, yes, I think that could do it. That could partly close some of these gaps. But I think we live in a world where, like, people are already sorting into different environments where, like, either they're cut off from that information or they already have that information at their disposal. I think in this.
An even lighter touch version of this intervention would be just sort people according to their risk score, and students below that cutoff get that information.
Yeah, so I think that's where I think that then you're like sort of tracking students, right? So that has its own, I think there's a whole set of issues related to that, right? If you start tracking students, if you think about the case where you put all typically minority students or low SES students are going to be less prepared. If you start having these segregated classes, that's going to have other implications. You see what I'm saying, right? Politically, I think it's going to be very hard.
Partly that's what the program is doing.
Partly that's what it's doing. Yeah, but it's not doing it. Yeah, exactly.
But I think one thing which is highlight that is important, that it's a very early.
That's the key. I think the key is here, and you're absolutely right. I think getting these students at the right time, because there are these small windows. Once they close, it's too late. And you're absolutely right. That's super important.
I think the information thing would play out over time. But early intervention is.
Yeah, but I think what Farouk is saying, if there was a way like you could get the right information at the right time. So I think going forward, for example, one of the things that we want to do is, so part of it is also the university has this information, right? And this is maybe like not, these systems are not always integrated. So one of the things we want to do is start doing targeted interventions with students. So we already have baseline data on these students. So let's say if I can identify a set of students who are at a very high risk of mental depression, for example, I can then start targeting interventions at them. And that's what you want to do. Or like if there are students who are misinformed about returns to college majors, then you want to, I think that's it. But think about it, like to do those targeted interventions, you need baseline data. It's not very demanding. It's it should be super, like that's what we're now talking with ASU to make a survey part of the incoming process. Because once you have that information, you could do targeted interventions, and that's what you want to do. That will help us answer the bigger question that you had. But I think part of it is information, and again, there are ways of intervening and providing social support also, right? So.
You didn't start working with faculty.
That's right. That's true. That's true. Yeah.
In what sense is the University of College responsible for the website? I think students may have selected the wrong.
Yeah.
And the college and university may have selected the wrong students.
No, but you're absolutely right. But I think dropout rates is something that all college administrators look at.
And switching seems to be not bad at all.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. Switching. So I want to be very clear. Dropout might be the optimal thing for some students. Like we don't want to have interventions which keep students in college for too long either, right? But part of, and this is where targeted like what is the friction here? Is it that students don't? Part of what I showed you is there's a mismatch happening. Students are sorting into majors for which they're not prepared. If that's what is going on, then you want to tell them, okay, maybe given your interest, this is not the right major. Maybe you should look at these. So it's not that switching majors could be very optimal. We're not saying, if anything, the message that I'm pushing here is more students should be switching majors.
Robert Lucas has switched the major from history to economics.
Sorry?
Robert Lucas.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, students switch majors in all directions all the time, and it could be optimal. Yeah.
It's not the case that only the bad students.
Oh no, that's absolutely. But typically, the students who are a big determinant of major switching is grades. You're absolutely right. Like I myself switched majors in my undergrad. I started, but that wasn't for grades reasons. So, but
Seems to be that the university college has to pay a major role in selecting the right major.
But that's the thing. You're not selecting students by major. That's the thing. For the most part, you just there are two things. Like one is you might I'm going to extrapolate from your statement is you might say, okay, maybe colleges should at the point of acceptance already take into account who's going to drop out and who's not, and then offer admissions accordingly. That's an extreme version of what you're proposing. That's not something.
For instance, if I come to you and say, sir, I want to do a PhD thesis, you say, whether you should not do that, whether you should drop it. Because you know from your experience, this person has a capacity or not.
Sure. Yeah, but that
context I'm referring to the talking to going on.
Yeah, so you can say, okay, schools can already have such strong screening criteria that they don't. Yeah, but that's not what public schools and.
Point there is you say you want to be inclusive.
Yes.
Then that becomes a great.
Yeah.
And I think that's where.
And that's where public schools or community colleges, right? So.
If you want, say you want to run, sort of grants programs to get kids who are coming from backgrounds that haven't done.
What I think in Lahore, for instance, the many private schools always take the very best students so that they can run.
I mean, there's always cream skimming, right? Like. Yeah, but we know. Yeah, but there's always going to be cream skimming, right? Like, but that's inevitable. Yeah. Yes.
But we also see persistence in the bad shocks. So if they had a bad shock in the start, but like switch the major, so then we should not see.
So typically, I think, of course, there is serial correlation in these shocks. Of course, like someone who struggled in the first year is also very likely to be struggling going forward. What happens is you see differential attrition along the way. So those who got a bad shock, X% of them will drop out after the first semester, some proportion the next, and so on. Some still are able to. It's not that. So there's a lot, but there's going to be duration dependence along the way.
You have the transcript, right? So you can look at the transcript only for the first year, or
no, we have the full transcript data. So all the outcomes I showed you were terminal outcomes, like ever graduating and all those things.
you can see like how next semester runs the shocks.
Sure, you can do that. I think the problem is then you start running into indigeneity issues even more and more. Yes.
So for students who want to continue in generation growth, are there positive outcomes for them as well in the LEAD program?
Yeah, so the LEAD program, the issue is we're underpowered here. So I only showed you the overall outcomes. I didn't cut the data by first generation status. So because of the subpopulation at which it's targeted, you have disproportionately more first generation and low SES students in that sample. Now the question is whether the impacts are larger for them or not. We are underpowered to detect those.
But I think that would be a good area for this, because if that is the case, that there's a huge gap between the two, and there isn't a very huge gap between the two, then it should mean that maybe there's something wrong with how we do college.
No, that's right. So yeah, so that's right. So we can't really detect differences, but you're right. The way you framed it, I don't think I disagree with that.
I think somewhere on the slide you mentioned that when you're matching students, you're also matching them with their college credit.
Yes.
What exactly was the criteria? Because I just, if you say one thing that you've taken out from me, as you pointed out, is that the earlier that we catch them, that's the better, right? So if we go back, not just in the first semester, but go back to their high school.
Yeah, so we don't have that. We only have their high school GPA, which is not a very good measure for the reasons I mentioned earlier. And the other is the ACT scores, because that's a standardized measure. So that's what we're using in the matching exercise. Because ASU also has that math test that they administer to everyone, we have that measure also. But I would say high school GPA itself is not a good measure of ability, unless you can control for high school quality.
You should design a few tests which are no weight and anything, just to prepare your students come in.
You could. But I mean, I'll be happy if they let us do a survey, and then, but yeah. So, but yeah.
Thank you. You've been very generous with your time. Thanks, everyone. There's tea and snacks outside, so please help yourself.
Thanks.